Great to be with you. I saw one of you came in this morning and said, really looking forward to learning with you this morning. I said, well, wait till we're done, because this is depressing. It's really depressing. I'll schmooze for a couple minutes while folks are rolling in. But the framework for our study this November is to cover 30 years of Israeli history. So we began last week with an overview, a retrospective of the life and the legacy, especially, of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, Zichrono Livracha, of blessed memory, who was felled by an assassin's bullets on November 4th, 1995. Last Sunday, we commemorated his 30th yahrzeit. We also did with our teenage students, kind of our most vigorous and eager learners, sat around my table in my office with Cantor Kleinman and a 19-year-old Israeli Shinshinit who's on a gap year between high school graduation and entering the army next summer, and 6 or 7 wonderful 11th and 12th graders. And we also had a conversation about the life and legacy of Rabin, and then we gave a brief tribute to him on Friday night for the Shabbat associated with the yahrzeit. So now it's a new week, and the intention, my hope, is that each of the following 3 lessons, today, next week, and the following, wrapping up the Sunday before Thanksgiving, will cover a 10-year span. So I've divided it very neatly. It actually happens to break out both logically that way, and also it's easy to make kind of units of meaning, to go from 95 to 2005 as we will today, leave us with a little bit of a cliffhanger. Next week, 2005 to 2015, and then the following week, 2015 to 2025, with an emphasis on the war. I'll relate to you my sources. I'll be happy to provide everybody with a bibliography, just not today. I'm kind of teaching as I'm going with this course, and grateful for the opportunity to refresh my own learning as we teach. So I think it's important to introduce a word that's going to come back in today's lesson, and that is an important part of the discourse around Israel and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict today, and that is the word intifada. Intifada is an Arabic word that means to shake off, right? It means a shaking off, and the idea is that from the standpoint of the Palestinian narrative, from their experience, this Arabic word connotes the Palestinian narrative that they are under the yoke of an oppressor that must be shaken off through resistance. So sometimes it is called resistance, other times the word is translated as uprising. We're going to see that in application, the way in which that word is applied not once but twice to 2 different significant long periods of conflict, of violent conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, one in the late 1980s and then again in the late 1990s and early 2000s, that the meaning of the word, or I should say the connotations around that word intifada, begin to change. I'll say more about it because I'm going to try not to open with a sermon. But I wanted to refresh just a little bit on the context in which Rabin became prime minister for the second time, having, as we learned last week, stepped down in disgrace. And you can read more about that, or you can watch last week's class with my esteemed and beloved colleague and friend, Rabbi Jan Katsu. So the Rabin who was assassinated, of course, was in his second term as prime minister. So the first intifada represents the first organized effort of the Palestinians to draw attention to their plight in a way that was mostly staked around Palestinian youths throwing rocks, and at times projectiles more dangerous than rocks, though they didn't have rockets or guns or missiles. We're talking about homemade munitions, so rocks, stones, at times Molotov cocktails. I'll get into that. I'm trying to think of, it's hard to know where to pick up the thread. So one of the narratives that we will be tracing throughout the last 30 years of Israeli-Palestinian history will be the working into the conflict of religious extremism. The Palestinian Liberation Movement, whose principal figure, Yasser Arafat, did not begin as an overtly religious resistance movement. It was, however, always tied into an organization known throughout the Middle East, and that is called the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood, you still hear about it today. It is very much the precursor organization for Hamas, and Hamas has institutional ties to Muslim Brotherhood as it pops up in kind of chapters around the Middle East, in the Arab-speaking world. The Muslim Brotherhood is not a heavily centralized organization. It's more like a brand that is found in lots of parts of the Muslim Arab-speaking world. So the Muslim Brotherhood became the most prominent Islamist organization. And I have to clarify a lot of terms when I'm teaching about this part of the world and this part of history, that Islam is a religion that claims close to 1.5 billion adherents across the world. Not all Muslims are Islamists. Islamist or Islamism is a political doctrine rooted in the Muslim religion that suggests that what the Quran describes about the Ummah, which is the land that is held by the Muslim faith, by people of the Muslim faith, is part and parcel of what it means to be a Muslim. So there are some Muslims across the world who are motivated to enact their religious doctrine in political realities, that you can't separate in Islamism between your devotion as a Muslim spiritually and your political aspirations as a collective or as a nation. In some ways, Islamism therefore resembles political Zionism. Islamism is sometimes also associated with, there's a lot of overlap between these terms. I like to use the words jihadism interchangeably with Islamofascism, which again are political doctrines that draw on Muslim teaching, Muslim devotion, Muslim faith to make a case for the outcome being a political outcome and sanctioning violence in the achievement of those outcomes, right? So not all Islamists, jihadists, and Islamofascists, I should say not all Muslims are Islamofascists, Islamists, jihadists. All jihadists, Islamists, and Islamofascists are Muslim. We don't really know how this really breaks down in numbers. Many years ago, and this has never been disproved, my professor of the region, Paul Lips, who taught me when I was a rabbinical student in Israel, said, look, conservatively, let's say 90% of the world's Muslims are not Islamists. They do not have a political agenda, or that is not at the forefront of their faith, much less do they have the willingness to enact that political agenda through violence. However, let's say conservatively 10% do. And that was his number. He said, on the one hand, that could reassure us. On the other hand, today, if it is in fact 10%, that's 150 million people, right? Now all religions have their extremists. And, throughout history, I would make the case that even including today, more Jewish lives have suffered at the hands of the church than at the hands of Islamofascists. It's just, you have to put it into perspective. Jews certainly have their extremists, and last week's story wrapped up tragically with a Jewish extremist with political motivations to derail the peace process by murdering Rabbi. That was a direct enactment of a religious belief with a political outcome. right? And the willingness to use violence. The question is, even if 10% of Jews support or supported that action, we're now talking about a much smaller number of Jews in the world because there are somewhere between 15 and 16 million Jews. So somebody who can give me 10% of that, what is that, 150,000? Right? So, we're off by a scale of 1,000. So the danger, of course, with Islamofascism, in my view, is largely just on logical measures, one of scale, and not necessarily of type, though one could argue that as well. That is probably outside my wheelhouse, nor is it my intention to say which religion is more violent. I think that you can have people, look, I still am in the organized religion business because I believe at the end of the day, organized religion can be a great resource allocator for getting communities to do great work in the world. And I still believe that quietly, even if nobody's writing articles about it, more people of faith are doing quiet acts of goodness day in, day out. And having spent the morning in church, that premise was reaffirmed all the more for me this morning. But there are always bad actors, and I don't wish to say it's just a few bad apples. I think it's a lot of bad apples. And I do think that Islam has not undergone a kind of westernization program of reform, whereas many Jews have. Not all, though. Like a lot of the Jews in Israel today are not substantially westernized in terms of their outlook. They don't believe in liberal democracy. People often ask me, well, why does Netanyahu stay in power? And it's because a majority of Israelis, even if it's a small majority, even if it's a reluctant small majority, still think that he's the best person to lead the country. And many of his supporters, the majority of Netanyahu's supporters, are not Ashkenazi Jews who come from a Western Enlightenment tradition of liberal democracy. Netanyahu largely has support of Jews who come from places like Yemen, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and I could go on, all places that have no tradition of Western Enlightenment, democracy, values, all men are created equal, yada, yada, yada. That's not in anywhere in their kind of inheritance. It's not how they look at the world. In their world, going back generations, you vote for the strong man. You vote for the person who will keep you safe. And by the way, having grown up in the Middle East, you especially don't trust the leaders of the places where your ancestors came from, right? And so they play a very different political game, and their election calculus is based on a very different set of assumptions about the world. So on the subject of, Islamic radical or Islamofascism, Islamism among the Palestinian people, Arafat actually fought against Israel in the War of Independence with an armed faction of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Arafat does kind of come to prominence as a young militant associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. But, the guy, if you could see him, he dressed in military dress. He was not dressed like a cleric or his brand was not really what we see from Hamas today, which is explicitly religious in orientation, and Arafat was not. And for the last, let's say if we're in the late 80s now, so for the 40 intervening years between the War of Independence and the First Intifada, you see that the Palestinian liberation movement, headed by an organization that Arafat himself headed called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, resorts to a number of different means to achieve political ends, including violence. We are familiar with attacks like probably the most notorious, we referenced them last week, acts of hijacking, terrorism in the air, land, and sea, the Munich Olympic massacre of 1972. There are also political means that are used to achieve the ends that the Palestinians wish to achieve, which is hard to define. I think the Palestinians begin their program of national aspirations in the early to mid 60s. And really, it's not until after the Six-Day War, when in its lightning strikes against its neighbors to the south in Egypt and to the north in Syria, which managed to produce what we talked about this last week, Israelis concluded was almost a divine intervention, a miraculous, a messianic outcome, where all of a sudden, after 6 days, Israelis find themselves for the first time in 2,000 years having regained custody of all of Israel's holy sites, the whole West Bank, the Sinai, and Gaza, right? So, and the Golan. Like, huge territorial expansion, a territorial expansion not seen since the days of the Maccabees in the 3rd century BCE, 2nd century BCE. Around the year 175 is the Maccabean uprising. And the Maccabean monarchs who followed Judah and his band of Maccabees would expand the borders of ancient Eretz Yisrael in ways that were not seen again until the 6-Day War. After that, you now have the Israeli military and civic apparatus with jurisdiction in all of those places, in the Sinai, in Gaza, and in the West Bank, and in the Golan, which especially for the now 2 million, but at the time it was probably many, many hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living in those territories, all of a sudden their project of liberation takes on a new urgency. And Arafat will, of course, become their avatar, the person who really is the one to, to have the microphone on the world stage. Some of the way in which his rhetoric finds its a receptive audience around the world is through none other than the United Nations. I know this will come as no surprise to anyone who's been following the United Nations, but it is not only in the last 2 years that Jewish people or Israelis have been aggravated by a sense that the United Nations does not exercise neutrality when it comes to evaluating world conflicts and which ones are going to merit its attention and its condemnation. In 1975, by a vote of 72 to 35, with 32 abstentions, the UN General Assembly passed resolution number 3379, and the important thing is not the number or the date, it's what it says, quote, which determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Very, very influential doctrine, right? And even today, the amplification of that message in academia, in the media, throughout the West, again, remember, this is 1975 that it's first said by the United Nations. By the way, a lot of that comes about by way of Soviet anti-Jewish propaganda. So a lot of this is actually coming from the Kremlin. It is a Soviet attempt to weaken the state of Israel, which was its enemy, and it was allied with neighboring Arab states like Syria, like Egypt, what have you. So that resolution was, in fact, revoked in 1991 with another UN General Assembly resolution. Nevertheless, the resolution that declared Zionism is racism has had deep staying power. And when Arafat actually spoke at the UN General Assembly conference, there's a very famous speech that he gives in which he says that the Palestinian people are ready to make peace with Israel, but then he pulls back his jacket to reveal that he has a holstered gun. So it's very clear that he never abandoned his almost self-created mythical status as a revolutionary fighter. And I think that's one of the reasons why we'll never really know what would have become of that handshake on the White House lawn that we talked about last week. But at the time, you have to understand that even a significant number of liberal-leaning Jews in Israel and across the world were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a sitting prime minister of Israel shaking hands with a man who, as the phrase went, has blood on his hands. But as Rabin and his supporters also, I think, very cogently rebutted, we don't make peace with our friends, we make peace with our enemies. And that was always the hope. And what I hoped we got across last week is that at the time, you have to really erase 30 years of accumulated stuff up here. At the time, it really seemed possible. At least it did to me. I'll also acknowledge I was 21. I was 20 in 1993. And 20-year-olds think differently than 50-year-olds. So you might have been among the people who were more skeptical about a quote-unquote reformed terrorist and a prime minister who, by the way, was also the figure in Israeli life most associated with the IDF at the time, Yitzhak Rabin. So to Palestinians, he also looked like a person with blood on his hands. And that's the power of it. But again, if you're only looking at it from your side, you don't really see all of that. On December 9th, 1987, so we're going back 38 years, an Israeli truck driver accidentally ran over 4 Arab workers in the Gaza Strip. The long simmering Arab street in the West Bank and in Gaza exploded in fury, and a kind of spontaneous outpouring of violence with masses of thousands of angry Palestinians, mostly young men, confronting IDF soldiers, throwing rocks, and then throwing off Molotov cocktails. And this resistance movement is what is first termed the Intifada, the shaking off. It lasts 6 years. So it lasts from, it lasts right up until the advent of Oslo. And Oslo was very much a response to 6 years of violent confrontation between Palestinian, mostly youth, and the IDF, exchanging fire, often not live fire, rubber bullets, water cannon, and sometimes live fire, which of course will immediately be framed in whatever street is naming it as massacre. It amplifies an already growing strand of extremist viewpoint within, again, I'm going to say the Palestinian street, which just means ordinary Palestinians. And it also, I think, accelerates the rise of Muslim extremism, jihadism, Islamofascism, Islamism within the Palestinian population. Like most populations at the time, the Palestinian people were actually more secular than religious, similar to Israeli society at the time. You know, throughout most of its history, Israel has had a overwhelmingly dominant secular population with a minority of very vocal, and I would argue, overly empowered Orthodox or Haredi Jews. That balance is shifting demographically and also in terms of hearts and minds. But even today, 70% of Israelis would call themselves secular or chiloni, and another 30% would call themselves religious or dati. And within those who call themselves religious, there are those who are, we're Jews. What can I tell you? It's like there are some whose religion is very much engaged in the modern world and political outcomes. There are those who are willing to embrace violence. The majority of those who are religious are not willing to embrace violence. There are some who live in self-made ghettos and shtetls that intend to replicate 17th century Poland, and there are many who don't. Like there are many of Orthodox Jews who will use cell phones that have the internet attached, and there are many Orthodox Jews who don't. So the whole thing, once you get inside of the religious world, it is far more diverse and complex than it is made out to be looking from the outside in. Ruth, you had a hand up. Right. I do not think the PLO ever called for the outright destruction of Israel. It called for Palestinian liberation from the Israeli occupation. And the debate that to this day is probably unresolved, but I think over the last 30 years has become clearer and clearer and clearer, is that, there has been a diminishing share of Palestinians whose major grievance with Israel is 1967, and a growing share of Palestinians whose major grievance with Israel is 1948. That's shorthand that's compellingly framed by Ari Shavit in his book, My Promised Land, The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel, which I commend to all of you. What's that? Yeah, many of you do own it, still widely available. No, that's Dennis Ross. Yeah, there are a lot of there's so many great books out there. I'll put together a bibliography. I've just been a little bit, trying to play catch up with life. So the PLO was not committed to the destruction of the Jewish state. It was committed to an end to occupation. Now again, occupation is a word that unfortunately has suffered from a lack of clarity and has also been politicized and weaponized in certain ways, that there are Jewish congregations where the rabbi can't even use the word without being chased out of the room. I will do my best to use the word as it is used today, which is it's a term that Israelis use to describe the condition of life in the West Bank. It is not a term that most Israelis today are willing to apply to Gaza, and we're going to learn why at the end of today's lesson. But occupation, meaning what happened to the West Bank and Gaza and Sinai and Golan in 1967, right? And so the condition that the Palestinians who have lived in the West Bank and Gaza is much more complicated. Gaza is really hard when we get to the idea of occupation. But the idea is that the Palestinians who live in the West Bank do not uniformly have the mechanisms for sovereignty, self-determination, representation in a government. Many of their even like basic utilities are not controlled by a Palestinian authority or the Palestinian Authority. They're controlled by Israel. There are parts of the West Bank where Palestinians have both military and civil jurisdiction, but those places are not geographically contiguous with other parts of the West Bank where they have either one or neither. In other words, there are parts of the West Bank where Palestinians live with neither civil nor military jurisdiction, like Hebron, which is always the worst in the West Bank, where you basically have a small number of heavily armed Israeli security officials ruling over a larger population of Palestinian Arabs. That's the condition in Hebron. There are legitimate security reasons why that is the case. I believe that it is reductionist to hold up Hebron as the totality of what life in the West Bank is like, because then you also have places like Ramallah, where Palestinians can come and go freely, where they actually have a measure of civil and military jurisdiction. They have their own security forces. I've been to Ramallah several times. It's where the government sits. It's quite a nice city. I mean, people are out tonight eating pita. But that's not the whole West Bank is like a Swiss cheese divided into areas called A, B, and C that describe the various limitations or freedoms that Palestinians are given. And at the end of the day, those decisions are not made by Palestinians, certainly not alone. So that, we can talk more about these terms. I think they're important. But Hamas, in contrast, and this is back to Ruth's question, was founded for the express purpose of liberating all of historic Palestine from Zionist occupation from the river to the sea. That language is in the Hamas charter then. It was revised, but it is still there now. Right? The program of Hamas is religiously motivated, and it comes from, again, an extremist interpretation of Quranic Muslim doctrine that declares that land where Muslims live must be exclusively governed by Muslims, and that anyone who is not a Muslim may be allowed to live with certain rights and privileges, either as second-class citizens known as dhimmi, which include people of the book. So in traditional Islamic societies, Jews have actually had kind of most favored nation status, or second most favored nation status, right? Where Jews were never heretics. They were never considered to be infidels. The infidel is the lowest, right? In Muslim society. The infidel, according to Hamas, you must kill because there's a zero tolerance policy. Jews actually traditionally have always been dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I, second-class citizens, but a kind of privileged status because we, like Muslims, are monotheists and we share a corpus of sacred literature. However, Hamas adheres to the most extremist version of an already extremist document. Sorry, Derek, I'm wandering out of the frame. I reckon I have a tendency to do that. There's like a gravitational pull to my left side. I'll do this too. That in Muslim land, so land that is promised by God to the Muslim people, to the adherents of God and his prophet Muhammad, that land cannot be sovereign for Jews. right? Jews don't have a right. And in fact, it is considered a terribly painful stain of humiliation for these radicalized Muslims to have a Jewish state in the middle of what they believe is the Ummah, or the Caliphate, God's own declared holy land for the Muslims, right? And by the way, from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River on the eastern boundary to the Mediterranean, in case, there's been a lot of talk. You've probably seen it's like, oh, they don't even know what river, what sea. Okay, there. Now that series on YouTube, anyone can come and learn. From the river to the sea means from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, which of course is parsed by Israelis and their supporters as quote-unquote genocidal because it calls for the erasure of a Jewish state in that same territory, right? So if you think this is relevant only to what's happening in the late 80s and early 90s, think again. This is very much today's conversation. So Hamas was founded in 88, and it incorporates talking points in its charter, by the way, from a wonderful little volume called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a notorious Russian forgery, which premised on the idea of a secret cabal of globalists, we would call them today, but of course Jews, who had engineered secret plans to control the banks and the media and the houses of power and politics to run the world. And that, by the way, so it's very interesting. There are basically three vectors of modern anti-Semitism, 2025. There's far-right anti-Semitism. That's the stuff that gets tied up with white nationalism, both in Europe and in the States. That's Charlottesville 2017. That's Unite the Right. That's Jews will not replace us. It's not white folk being worried about being replaced by Jews, by the way. It's white folk worrying that Jews are going to participate in aggressive programs of bringing black and brown people to America as immigrants and refugees to replace them. That's Jews will not replace us. But that version, by the way, many of the most violent anti-Semitic crimes that have been committed over the last 10 years, including Tree of Life massacre in 2018 in Pittsburgh and El Paso, their perpetrators have left behind manifestos that traffic in that far-right white nationalist anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism on the left, I don't need to give you a big overview, that's typically manifests as anti-Zionism, not I have a problem with the government of Israel, or even I have a problem with the state of Israel as it is presently constituted, or I have a problem with occupation, meaning that the military still basically runs the lives of 2 million plus Palestinians in the West Bank, or I have a problem with the blockade of Gaza. That's not what I mean when I say anti-Zionism. I think you'll find plenty of Zionist Israelis who have all of those problems and will say it. Anti-Zionism in the anti-Semitic dimension is Israel does not have a right to exist as a state specifically for the protection of Jewish people and for the flourishing of Jewish civilization, I always add. Because Israel is much more than a survival project. Israel is home to half of the world's Jews, and it is, in my view, actually the seat of Jewish civilization and has been for quite some time, and it's just our ignorance and chauvinism as American Jews or diaspora Jews that gets in the way of us seeing that and acknowledging it. Even if you don't go as far as I do to say that it's all about Israel, I would say we need each other. There is no flourishing Jewish people without Israel, and I think it's fair to say, nor without the diaspora community as well. We need both. It's two. It's half and half. You can't just cut off half the body. In any case, the kind of leftist anti-Semitism that is prevalent today is that kind. And then there's a third vector of anti-Semitism, which is Islamofascist anti-Semitism or jihadist anti-Semitism. And all I wanted to point out here is that a lot of that is an import product from pre-Soviet Tsarist Russia into Soviet Russia and from the Nazis. Like, you have Muslim clerics in Palestine, in British Mandatory Palestine, meeting with Hitler during the war years and specifically collaborating, and one of the results is that Nazi anti-Jewish propaganda has found its way through every aspect of the Arab world's anti-Jewish hatred program and propaganda, right? It's very much interlinked, and this is a classic early example that Hamas's own charter, written in the late 80s, directly lifts quotations from Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which had been written more than 80 years earlier. Okay. Hamas insisted in its charter that, quote, Jews founded the United Nations and the Security Council in order to rule over the whole world, and they placed blame for most international wars on the Jews, and it called for an Islamic uprising to eliminate Israel. So I think it's important to recognize that even as Islam is becoming a more dominant force in the 80s and 90s and 2000s and up till to the present day, in the politics of resistance, so too is religion more prominently entering the conversation about Zionism and is actively shaping the Zionist vision. And so, again, we talked last week about the assassin who killed Rabbi Yigal Amir, age 25 at the time he committed the crime. 30 years later, at age 55, still behind bars, he's serving a life sentence. I don't think he is ever eligible for parole. And Israel does not have the death penalty. Yes, they put Eichmann to death, but that was a moment of national reckoning and has not since, at least not since publicly, executed any criminals who stood trial. You have to say that, you have to be very, very careful. Like what happens in military jurisdictions is a little bit of a different story. But the official narrative is that Israel does not have a death penalty for its civil population. Michelle. Great. I'm going to hand you a mic so that everyone can hear you without you trying to shout too hard.
Especially online. Yeah, just to grab a few quotes, a few quick lines from the National Charter, which is dated 1968. Palestine is the homeland of the Arab Palestinian people. Palestine, with the boundaries it had during the British Mandate, is an indivisible territorial unit. The people possess the legal right to their homeland, and then skipping ahead, I just want to add that Article 9, armed struggle is the only way to liberate Palestine. Article 10, commando action constitutes the nucleus of the Palestinian Popular Liberation War. I'll give you back your.
That's really helpful.
Your mic.
Yeah, really clarifying. Oslo rewrote the book. So out of this uprising that took 6 years between 87 and 93, you have high-level officials secretly convening in Oslo, in Norway, to try to change the situation on the ground. The play, Oslo, now I'm blanking on who wrote it, but is a local guy. He lives in the river towns. An interesting Jewish man. Presents kind of, I think, a very positive appraisal of the process. In hindsight, particularly in a post-October 7th reality, there are many, many, many more people who are so sufficiently disillusioned with the idea of a two-state solution, for plenty of good reasons, by the way. But again, I think it's unfair. It's always unfair to superimpose our worldview on places and times that are far removed from our own. What we know now, post-October 7th, does not change the fact that looking at the situation as it was in the early 90s, it was clear that whatever was happening was not working, and that it was starting to turn the court of world opinion against Israel, because the images that were being broadcast now on 24/7 cable news, which is a new thing in the early and mid-90s and a really important development, that people in their homes could be getting live updates around the clock, and the cycle of media outrage was getting more and more people to tune into things like CNN, and that persists even more amplified to this day. That you have a number of Jews at the time who nevertheless say, we have to come up with a different way. We have to come up with a political solution. And the solution is generally framed in shorthand as the two-state solution. A state for Palestinians, a state for Israelis. One of the things that's going to get discussed at Oslo and never satisfactorily worked out is the territorial integrity, because the bulk of Palestinians are now living in two geographically disconnected corridors. You have this small strip on the Mediterranean known as Gaza, and then you have the West Bank. The Sinai, by the way, of course, which belonged previous to the 1967 Six-Day War to Egypt, was given back to Egypt in exchange for a peace treaty that continues to hold to this day, and for which Anwar Sadat paid with his own life. right? So I'm not going to get into that history. I taught it 2 years ago. You can go back to the YouTube. Jim, Steve. Yeah, we're going to get to that. Right. We're going to get to, well, what exactly has prevented two states for two peoples from becoming a reality? We can unpack that, and we will today. It's a big part of our narrative. Steve and then Michelle. Right. I mean, again, I think we often, even more globally, and I appreciate your comment, I think its relevance for us is that we continue to think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms that are so thoroughly inflected by our experience as diaspora Westerners. And the Middle East play by its own rules. Micha Goodman, a brilliant author whom I quoted in my Rosh Hashanah remarks this year, has a book out in Hebrew called Hayom HaShmini, which means the eighth day. I can't wait for it to be published in English because I don't have the intestinal fortitude to tackle the whole thing in Hebrew. It'll be a long, slow go. And Goodman basically makes the case that Israel is in a paradox or a dilemma that he frames as follows. In the politics of the Middle East, Israel must do everything, particularly in war, but Israel, even in peacetime, must do everything in its power to be feared by its enemies. And in the West, in order for Israel to succeed, Israel must do everything in its power to be loved. Israel wants to be loved by the West, right? Startup nation. It wants the world to invest in its technologies. It wants to export its drip irrigation system to support American agriculture. It wants to import its military technology to support the way we fight wars here in the West, but not at the expense of what is framed as basic morality, right? And so Israel will engage in warfare tactics that are precisely intended to do what war is supposed to do. I mean, by the classic definition of war, which is to get your enemy to do what you want your enemy to do. In the case of the war since October 7th, that is to have its political power structure decapitated, neutralized, for Hamas and its militants to lay down its arms and to return hostages. Right? Those have always been the stated aims, but Goodman points out that not only is there the question of, are those aims achievable? Have they ever been achievable? Secondarily, but probably primarily, do those same aims, in fact, make it harder for Israel to succeed in the West, at least in what we call the war for hearts and minds? Right? So it could be argued that Israel has achieved many tactical victories over the last 2 years, and we'll get to this in a couple of weeks, but in many ways has lost on the strategic front. And certainly, inasmuch as some of fighting wars is about hearts and minds, you know, Hamas will get to declare victory. I know that seems challenging to swallow, but I promise you that's already the narrative in progress. It's one of the reasons why Hamas has spent the last month mopping up in Gaza and asserting its control through the way only Hamas does, or Hamas always does, which is through violence and extortion and executing anyone it thinks is not loyal. So Hamas is going to say, we're still standing. The Zionists didn't get us. We live to fight another day. And not only that, now the whole world hates our enemy too. Like, that's the victory for Hamas. And by the way, yeah, right. Okay, I think we have to kind of like live with that reality. Okay, I'm going to take Sandra and Michelle. I saw had a hand. Hamas is chartered in 1987. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes. Yep. They're not. They're not. But ironically, if the West Bank would ever call for elections, you know, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, has held power over the very weak Palestinian Authority, the Fatah political party, which is, by the way, just the PLO. It's just the PLO's political entity. Mahmoud Abbas has been the head of Fatah and the Palestinian Authority for 17 years now, and shows no signs of calling for elections because the Palestinian street is being polled consistently, and after the war, support for Hamas went way up and persists today. So Hamas would prevail in the West Bank. Correct. Arafat was in charge of the Palestinian people, as it were, until his death. Okay, let me move forward so we can... Oh, Michelle, quickly. That's right. Yeah, it's one of those, like all anti-Semitic canards, whether they are Protocols of the Elders of Zion or blood libels. You know, again, this is one of the reasons why I spoke out strongly against Mamdani. He's now the mayor, so we have to live with that reality and figure out what comes next. I'm not going to use this platform to talk about that. That's a sermon for another Shabbos. It's always the question of, all right, well, that wasn't what we wanted. What do we do next? Wasn't what I wanted. More vexing, it might be what some of your kids, grandkids, or their friends wanted. All right, again, another Shabbos. But one of the things to me that's so vexing about Mamdani is that he traffics in blood libel. The most recent one that came to light was in September of 23. He said, when the police have their boot on your neck, it's the IDF that laced the boot. So drawing a false and widely discredited connection that proposes that the IDF trains American law enforcement to brutalize black and brown people, right? That's a blood libel. In other words, it traffics in an emotionally incendiary narrative that has the major inconvenience of not being true. Okay, so I'm going to pick up where we left off last week. I wrote in my notes that I don't think the peace process ever recovered because Yigal Amir didn't just murder the prime minister, he murdered the peace process. He was, as we said, tried and convicted in short order, together with 2 accomplices, both of whom have completed their sentences. One served, I think his brother-in-law served for like 7 years, and another one for 16 years. They live and go about as free men today. In Israel. And I think one of the things that should not be discredited is the fact that Amir did not act alone. He had the aid and comfort of a huge network of support within the ultra-Orthodox community, and I'll talk about why in a minute. Maybe I'll go there now. It's elsewhere in my notes. But the ultra-religious activist argument. And again, not all ultra-religious Jews believe in taking up arms to achieve political outcomes. The same way not all Orthodox Muslims, not all devout or pious Muslims believe that the way we enact God's will on earth is by taking up arms and achieving political outcomes. A number do. A very large number, which is a problem. The communities in which Yigal Amir, the assassin, and his accomplices traveled became increasingly radicalized around the idea that Rabbi Katsu introduced to us last week, and I'll amplify this idea. He said that Rabin was a moser. He had sold out the Jewish people, not just the state of Israel, right? For Amir, the assassin, and his associates and his teachers, the argument was that the betrayal that Rabin had perpetrated was against the Jews. It was a religious matter. By engaging in peace talks with their enemies that would, if Oslo were fully implemented, result in exchanging land for peace, of giving back land. And as Rabbi Katsu said last week, well, it's a problem if you believe that the land has been promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all of their progeny forever and ever and ever, time immemorial. Secondly, they raised a legal argument from the Talmud. Those of you who have studied Gemara, Talmud with me are familiar with this argument. We covered it a couple years ago, known as Din HaRodef. the law of the pursuer. And the basic halachic or Jewish legal argument goes like this. If you, as a Jew, see somebody about to perpetrate a crime, particularly a violent crime, you are not only authorized, but mandated. It is a mitzvah for you to go out and stop that person from committing a crime. So the law of the pursuer is you see somebody pursuing somebody else with a gun, chasing down an old lady with a handbag that she's clutching, trying to get her, and you're in a position to take aim and debilitate or even kill the pursuer. By all means, not only could you, you should, you must. And therefore, that was the legal rationale. It was being talked about in these yeshivot, these yeshivas, including the one in which Amir was studying. And it was widely known in these communities that the law of the pursuer was being used as a case in point. Now, of course, afterward, in the extensive investigations and interrogations that followed the murder, everyone denied it. Said, well, we didn't want him to actually go and do it. It's just hypothetical when it's a yeshiva, right? But Amir, and only Amir and his two accomplices, his two co-conspirators, one of whom I think provided the weapon, another one hollowed out the bullets so that they would inflict more damage. Anyway, at point-blank range, only they were convicted. But my view is that there was a huge apparatus of incitement that led to it, and to this day, there are many, many Israelis. I mean, I'm talking about, 2 million who probably think that was a good thing. And by the way, just from a Machiavellian outcomes or ends justifying means perspective, if it was always your goal to stop Israel and the Palestinians from producing a two-state solution, from compromising, mission accomplished, right? So one could argue, although it offends my moral sensibilities as a Jew and as a rabbi deeply, one could argue that from the standpoint of efficacy, Amir did exactly the thing that many Israelis to this day support. And that is why he continues to be either quietly or even overtly lionized by a certain segment of the Israeli people. And if you want to know what ails Israel today, a big part of the problem is this, and that those folk are sitting in the Knesset right now and not in the opposition party. They're sitting in Netanyahu's cabinet. They have high-level ministries, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich. These are people who think that Amir and his associates got it right by assassinating a sitting prime minister. Whatever your political views, the issue is not just that it was Rabin, it's that they believe that political violence was a necessary means to achieve a necessary outcome. Okay, so what happens after Rabin dies? Well, the peace process, you'll remember the eulogies offered last week. We had wonderful citations from King Hussein of Jordan and Bill Clinton. Immediately, his number two man, Shimon Peres, became the interim prime minister. Now, I remember this, of course. I was living 3 blocks from the prime minister's residence, so this was very much in my face my first year of rabbinical studies. Born Shimon Persky in 1923 in Poland, Shimon Peres had seen it all, and he was fully committed to Rabin's vision of peace and to the Oslo process, even though during their lifetimes the two often sparred, including about implementation of that vision. But once Rabin died, Peres very quickly said, I will be the one to pick up this mantle. The people protesting in the square that night that Rabin was shot, you are the future. And he really appealed to Israel's labor left and to its youth, and still we'll see what happened. So according to Oslo, what happened next is what had to happen. In November and December, remember he was assassinated first week of November. For the next 2 months, and I remember watching this, the IDF withdrew from most major cities in the West Bank. The only place where they stayed was Hebron, because the idea was that gradually the IDF would leave control over to the Palestinian Authority, which again was the political administrative apparatus for governing Palestinian society through Oslo and after. The part of the arrangement between Israel and the PA, the Palestinian Authorities, that the IDF would actually train Palestinian security forces to provide their own security. I watched this happening in Jerusalem my year there. I saw Palestinian police officers and other security personnel, heavily armed with machine guns, wearing a blue camo. That's how you could tell who they were from the uniform, being trained by IDF officers and Israeli security professionals in self-defense. And I saw them doing like martial arts exercises in public places in Jerusalem. It was pretty wild. You could see this quite openly. It was all part of Oslo. The PA then took over, and after the elections, Arafat and his Fatah party won. So it did seem at the time, we're talking winter 1995-96, that statehood for the Palestinians was moving forward. Hamas then decided to make its big debut. Now remember, Hamas had been around at this point for about 8 years and had taken responsibility for a number of terrorist attacks that were intended to degrade trust in the peace process and turn Israelis against it, in addition to ginning up support for Palestinian radicalism against the Zionist occupier. That's their narrative, right? And the way in which this goes, the logic is, if you commit acts of terror against a population, do they become more left-wing or more right-wing? More right-wing, right? It's time to, we've got to defend ourselves. We have to protect ourselves. So fear rightly takes over. If your favorite restaurant, the bus you take to work every single morning, is now a target, and your enemy says, by the way, this isn't terrorism against civilians. There is no such thing as an Israeli civilian. That's part of their narrative too. Everybody trains for the army. Even if you're 10 years old, you're just a soldier in the making. So part of their logic, I'm trying to withhold judgment, is think like a Hamasnik. That's a legitimate target. There's no such thing as a civilian target if you see your enemy is Israel is a military state, which is how they frame the issue for them. So they knew that it would turn the Israeli public against Oslo, and that's pretty much exactly what happened. Hamas began a campaign of suicide bombings in February, March, and April of that year. I lived through all of it. My class was, of course, very shaken by I would say, a once every other week suicide bombing that would claim anywhere between, 10 and 30 people at a time. Starting on buses, a cafe that many of my classmates frequented was blown up as well. Students from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, some of whom had friendships with fellow rabbinical students in my class, were murdered in these episodes. Our class kind of sat down with our professors. I have to say it's a point of pride, for which I take no personal credit, that our class resolved that nobody was going to go home. It was March of 95. We had been living through it for a few weeks. We were shaken up. A number of us, I think, would have loved the opportunity to go home, could have exercised it, but we kind of made a pact. Like, you know what? The term ends in 2 months. This is what Jewish leadership looks like. We're staying in Israel because Israel needs us and we need Israel. Like that was, I'm to this day very proud of my class and my professors who made it clear the choice was up to us, and sometimes being a Jewish leader means you do hard things. And that has always informed how I think about the situation. I had lunch yesterday with 2 wonderful students, one of whom was on a birthright trip at the time the war broke out with Iran this summer, and got herself to Cyprus on a 13-hour boat ride, which the teens on that trip described as a booze cruise. But decided, nope, I'm going right back to Israel. And we heard from 2 of those students on the Bima. This was a different one. Like it's pretty great. Hamas suicide bombings continued throughout the winter and spring, and Peres had made a strategic calculation to move the election up to May. He didn't have to call it then. I think it was supposed to be 4 months down the road. Yoel would know if he's here. He's probably going to watch the live stream and send me an email correcting me, because it's not in my notes. On the day I returned home to the States, a new prime minister, so the day I left Israel was election day. And I arrived at JFK, and the results had come in while I was midair. And this was before you could get news on a flight. So I landed at JFK to find out that by a very narrow margin, Israel had just elected a charismatic 47-year-old named Benjamin Netanyahu, who was the opponent. And by the way, who had very much run on a platform of not officially the plan was we're going to proceed with Oslo. But to his innermost supporters, he was saying, my plan is not to make peace with the Palestinians, not to give the Palestinians a state. From that day to this day, that has always been Netanyahu's position. I mean, and you can say what you will about it, but I'm saying just without judgment, that is the Netanyahu plan, and that is what his supporters are voting for. His supporters, in large measure, are voting for we're not down with two states for two peoples. By the way, they have reason not to believe that that's a good idea. It's just like it's like what people say about capitalism. It's the worst possible way of running an economy, except for all the others. Right? I've always felt that a two-state solution, however lacking in pragmatism, is better than the alternatives both strategically and morally. And I get to focus on the moral stuff because I'm a rabbi. I toil in the vineyard of morality. But thank God I'm not a politician because I'd have to set a lot of that aside to achieve achievable outcomes. Okay. Netanyahu thought that Oslo was a misstep, but he still insisted that his government would implement the elements that were scheduled to be implemented on schedule. And he lost, largely because he was trying to have it both ways. So the next election actually took place in 1999. The campaign year was 1998, and a highly decorated soldier named Ehud Barak won the next election on a peace platform, saying, enough of this kind of like trying to do the dance. Oslo is still written. We need to get it to implementation phase. It's time to move forward and get this done with. What else is happening at this time? So now it is the late 90s, and as if Israel didn't have enough problems on its southern border with Gaza, by the way, remember, it signed a peace treaty with Jordan. So Israel now has peace with Egypt to the south. It has peace with Jordan to its east, but its northern border had never successfully been, I would say, taken the temperature down. Israel had this disastrous escapade in Lebanon in the early 80s. I'm not going to, again, you can go back and watch the YouTube from a couple years ago, learn more about the Lebanon war. And since then, Israel had maintained a strong military presence in southern Lebanon and all along the border, and was doing what it thought it could to degrade the capacity of its enemy on the northern border, which was Hezbollah, which is a paramilitary Islamo-fascist organization, again, believes that it is a moral affront to God that there is a Jewish political entity, a state, in the middle of Muslim land. Right? That's the Hezbollah, literally means Hizb, which is an Arabic word for party or political party. Allah. Hizb Allah means the party of God. Right? Its leader, who was killed in the last year, in I think like November of 24. There's the pager attacks, and then Hamas, then Hezbollah senior leadership, and then they went after Hassan Nasrallah, who was also killed by the IDF or the Mossad or whoever got to him. But he is a cleric, a Muslim cleric. So the party is explicitly Islamic and Islamist. So the thinking at the time, and again, this may seem strange to us today, is that with a still belligerent Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and in Syria being funded by Iran, so this is the kind of axis that Iran set up to fight its wars with Israel by way of terrorist proxies, right? So to kind of like take over these very weak states and make the real power Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria so that it had a direct front with Israel. So Iran doesn't share a border with Israel, but courtesy of Hezbollah, it really did effectively. Barak thought that if you could withdraw unilaterally from Lebanon, it would extricate Israel from the constant back and forth, bloody skirmishes and potential for its soldiers to be kidnapped along the border, which is exactly what would happen eventually in 2005. It also informed Barak's whole campaign was, we need peace with Syria, which was a slogan they had resuscitated from when I was there, from when Rabin was alive. The Israeli left actually had all of these bumper stickers. I've collected a whole bunch of them. They're in my office that say, Shalom im Surya achshav. Peace with Syria now. It's like unthinkable today. Except, well, no, not today. It is thinkable with today. It was unthinkable 2 years ago, right? He wanted to make peace with Syria, and Syria did not go for it. Why? Syria wanted Israel to remain in Lebanon so that it could continue to attack the IDF through its proxy Hezbollah. Welcome to the Middle East, my friends. Okay. Barak was also determined that his legacy was going to be, what Rabin couldn't do. He was going to be the one to make peace with the Palestinians. So he convened at Camp David. Who was the biggest, supporter of Barak? It was Clinton. Because Clinton also, at this point, wanted to cement his legacy. He also, you may recall, had some public image problems starting in the summer of 1998. And Clinton probably wanted a really, really, really good distraction from what was happening to Bill Clinton at the time. So Clinton convened at Camp David, and this is what Jim was referring to, together with Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel, and with Yasser Arafat. So it's summer of 2000, and they decide it's like winner-take-all chess. We're going to put everything on the table. So what are the issues that had stymied peace? Somebody said it before. The so-called Palestinian right of return, that's one of them. What else? Jerusalem. What do we do about a city that is both holy and politically important as a capital for both the Jews in Israel and for Palestinian Arabs and Muslims in Israel? Okay, what else? Settlements, right? That was a real thorn in the side. As of today, approximately 500,000 Jewish Israelis with citizenship live on the other side of the Green Line. That's the West Bank. I'm not going to get into Gaza yet. We'll finish with Gaza today. Well, of those 500,000 or so Jews living in the West Bank, let's do some math again. Let's say 10% are radicalized, religious extremists. I actually think it's more like 20%. Okay? I think it's more like 100,000 to 150,000 of them living in the West Bank believe that they and only they have a God-given right to live in that territory because it is part of biblical Israel. Nobody contests that, by the way. Archaeologists, like the whole West Bank, just read the Bible, read the Torah. The idea that Jews are not indigenous to this part of the world is hogwash. Of course the Jews are indigenous, and the archaeology proves it every single day. That's not a great reason to live in a land. Like, by that logic, well, I'd have to begin my class by saying, welcome to, our class. We give thanks to the Quarapis, the local tribe of Lenape Indians, natives who live in the Quarapis being a native word that means White Plains, by the way. And you have a Quarapis street downtown. Like, notice all the Indian names around here? Yeah, all right. So I don't necessarily believe that indigenousness is the only or best way to claim that you deserve to run a place. But that, indigenousness is one part of sovereignty. It's not the only part. In any case, so those are the four. Oh, the fourth being, what are the actual borders here? Because remember I said one of the challenges was Fatah, the PLO, Arafat had always called for a contiguous entity. But every plan for giving Palestinians a state and Jews a state of their own has implied or explicitly trafficked in the language of partition. And the problem with partition is there is no continuity or geographical contiguity between Gaza and the West Bank, which unfortunately is where Palestinians live, in many cases like just cousins and brothers and family members. It's not that far apart. It's an hour apart in traffic, right? So that's like from here to Brooklyn. Right, Gaza and the West Bank, they're not, at their smallest part, they're 9 kilometers. Israel, at its smallest, Israel is 9 kilometers wide. Very, very small. But there is no corridor. All right. But those are the issues that they put on the table. The process was negotiated by a great team, including Dennis Ross, Clinton's Middle East envoy, who wrote that book. What's it called? The Missing Piece. Thank you. He later wrote, both Barak and Clinton were prepared to do what was necessary to reach agreement. Both were up to the challenge. Neither shied away from the risks inherent in confronting history and mythology. Can one say the same about Arafat? Unfortunately not. Okay, well, that's his view as the American negotiator. Barak ended up offering 92% of the West Bank and sections of Jerusalem. A lot of what's over the Green Line, by the way, is still understood, if not formalized, that in any land for peace swap would still end up part of Israel. Like, there are parts over the Green Line that are so effectively merged with the administrative and political structure and landmass of Jerusalem that those would not be abandoned to the other side of the Green Line and say, sorry, all of you who've lived in this nice Jerusalem suburb, you're now actually in the state of Palestine. There is an understanding that there would be what are called carve-outs in any land for peace deal. And again, I think that the majority of the settlers living in the West Bank are not religious ideologues, much less those who are motivated to enact their political views with violence. Most Jews living in the West Bank went there because they have family there and because it's cheaper there and because the government incentivized them to with economic incentives over the last 60 years, almost 60 years. And it's beautiful. And they have these communities and in the best case scenario, they are living side by side with Palestinian villages and actually getting along and interacting. In the average scenario, they've deluded themselves into thinking that's the case. And in the worst case scenario, there's Hebron, which today is still a nightmare, particularly if you're a Palestinian, but I would argue it's a nightmare if you're an IDF soldier who's stationed to keep the peace in Hebron, because it's an unsustainable situation. Ruth. Right. I mean, they're cities. Yeah, people think like they're not just ramshackle, corrugated tin huts. These are beautiful cities. And again, so part of the grievance that the Palestinians have is they see these gleaming cities, these settlements, which are funded with, all of the largesse of the Israeli government, paid for with Israeli taxpayer dollars, protected by the IDF, whereas they live in relative squalor, not only of their own making, right? It was like, oh, the electricity went out again. We don't have clean water again. We don't have basic roads and sewage. We don't have trash being picked up. Our educational system is okay, you could say, well, that's your problem. But when it is right in your face that the Jews who are living 1 kilometer away from you enjoy all of this, imagine what that does for your sense of self, for your sense of dignity, for your national narrative. And by the way, Arab culture is an honor culture. Arab culture predominantly, is not a Western democratic tradition which believes that we should set aside our honor-related grievances to trust in the institutions of government, and, that will promote equality for all. That's not a thing that exists in Arab society. Many Jews don't believe it in Israel either, because 60% of Jews living in Israel come from Arab countries. They're part of an Arab diaspora. Javier. I believe that the 3 jurisdictions of A, B, and C, that is findable knowledge. Somebody should look it up. Don't misquote me. Somebody else look it up. We'll find out before the time's up. Norm. Next week. 07. Okay. All right, 15 minutes. I'm going to get us to 2005. So Barak ended up offering 92% of the West Bank and parts of Jerusalem. Arafat and his negotiating team rejected the offer out of hand. This is kind of a thrice-told tale at this point. Well, we've tried. They rejected it. End of story. I think there's more of a story. Mike, is that a hand up? Okay. Arafat's popularity after turning down the opportunity surged, which was part of his calculus. Why? Because in the eyes of the people, he had stood up to the Zionists. His calculus was that as long as he could drag out negotiations, the international community would fet him as a peacemaker. So why didn't he just say, I want nothing to do with Oslo? Again, think about that love and fear matrix that Israelis think about. It's really no different for the Palestinians. I need to figure out how not to be seen as a terrorist. I need to be seen as a peacemaker in the West. Whereas, if he signed an agreement, the minute he signs an agreement, Arafat thinks to himself, well, now my party is going to have to govern with accountability to the agreement. And it seemed increasingly clear to him that that was never going to happen. So, I mean, again, war requires that you, or conflict requires that you learn to think like your enemy. I think that from the standpoint of Arafat, his position is entirely logical. It's unfortunate, right? Because I'm a big peacenik at heart, or I used to be. Now I'm just a cynic. Okay, Michelle in the back. Yeah. It's great. Like the chain, I think there'd be a whole story to tell here that would go way outside of my areas of focus and certainly my areas of expertise to talk about how changing media has also changed the face of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And by the way, my focus is largely here on Israel vis-a-vis its neighbors and its enemies. There are fascinating developments happening within Israel at this time, right? So this is just the very, very embryonic part of Startup Nation. In America, the internet boom had boomed and busted at this point. The bubble burst in 2000. The boom was 98, 99. In Israel, it came somewhat later, and the bubble didn't pop so much as kind of deflated, but you actually have huge advances in Israeli technologies, particularly in mobile communications. So Motorola becomes an international powerhouse and puts a phone in every Israeli's hands. And so so everyone now has an opinion about the conflict. By 2002, a tiny little website would take off named YouTube, which allows anyone with a cell phone to film what's happening. So whereas before the first Intifada, you need a news crew out there with giant heavy cameras to capture what's happening and then send it to a news station, and then somebody has to decide to broadcast it, and somebody else has to decide how as a journalist to narrate it. We're moving into an era where literally a Palestinian or an Israeli on the street with an account, just film it, upload it, and that's a big difference between now and then. All right. So Barak, having failed, is out almost as quickly as he's in. In 2000, so he was in for 2 years. In 2000, a new prime minister takes office who's elected, and that is Ariel Sharon. It's a fascinating development. Now, Ariel Sharon was known as the hawkiest of the hawks, right? He had actually led the IDF in what happened in Lebanon in 1982. Again, watch my YouTube from a couple years ago if you want to know more about that debacle, but had continued to be seen as just brook no compromise, a big bear of a man with a gruff voice, again, a military man, but was not going to play nice, or that was the thinking. So before Barak was even out of office, what does he do? He leads an entourage up onto the Temple Mount. He did not enter the mosque, but it was parsed by pretty much everyone, including within Israel, as a deliberate provocation. He was, at the time, the opposition leader in the Knesset, right? So he was the guy to say, down with Barak. We can't make peace with these people. Was it legal? Probably. Was it a good idea? Well, it enraged the Palestinians, who the next day showed up with 20,000, mostly young men, who stormed the mount and threw rocks and no live ammunition until Israeli forces showed up and responded with small firearms, which escalated. 7 rioters were killed, 300 Palestinians and 70 Israeli police officers were wounded. The PA leadership described this as a massacre and called for jihad, in the sense of armed uprising against the Zionists. The second Intifada had begun. This was less, compare this to what had happened 13 years earlier. This was less of a mass revolt, but far more lethal, especially because now it was entangled with Islamo-fascist suicide bombing attacks, right? So Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other cells that we would consider terrorist cells that were explicitly motivated by a religious doctrine made this uprising their fight too. The conflict spread even to some parts of sovereign Israel where Israeli Arabs were induced to fight against their fellow citizens who were Jews. Things escalated. An Israeli commission investigated the events of October 2000 and concluded that Israeli police were unprepared for the scope of Palestinian violence and in most cases had overreacted to it. The typical cycle would feature Arab rioters with Molotov cocktails and arsonists burning forests, and then the Israeli security forces would respond with violence and crackdowns, and it was a further thorn in the side of the Palestinians that they never, rarely, cracked down on, for instance, West Bank hooligans who were perpetrating similar acts of violence and arson with Molotov cocktails against Palestinian farmers, olive grove workers, vineyard tenders, villages, right? So mosques. So part of the idea from the standpoint of the Palestinians is that there's a double standard here. The IDF will, not go after you. They'll go after you if you're a 15-year-old Palestinian with a rock or a Molotov cocktail, which is nothing, you can die from this little gasoline-filled incendiary weapon. Happened in Boulder, Colorado. That was the weapon of choice by a leftist anti-Semite who decided to say free Palestine while throwing Molotov cocktails at a group of Jewish protesters at a JCC who were saying bring them home now about our hostages. But when the IDF will police the Palestinians but not its own settlers, again, just the narrative does not end up creating peace. It ends up fomenting more violence. As the violence escalated, Clinton tried one last-ditch effort, knowing that he was leaving office, to resuscitate the peace process. So in December of 2000, this is like the last thing Clinton did. I remember this very well. Probably many of you do too. He proposed something known as the Clinton parameters. He would offer the Palestinians 96% of the West Bank, somewhere between 94 and 96%. He did not mention Gaza, but in 2001, after leaving office, he clarified that he believed Gaza would be part of a future Palestinian state, very ambiguous language. He proposed dismantling the isolated settlements in the kind of like the farthest reaches of the West Bank, while incorporating the settlements in the suburbs of Jerusalem into Greater Jerusalem. He proposed dividing East Jerusalem into a Palestinian and an Israeli capital, two separate areas, and that on the subject of the so-called Palestinian right of return, the Palestinian refugees would be given the right to return only to the state of Palestine, not to Israel proper. This has always been one of those sticking points that's all four of these have never been resolved, right? They're still the sticking points today. They'll still be the sticking points if Israelis and Palestinians decide to move on from the Gaza war to negotiate something. It's still going to come down to these four things. What are the borders? How do we ensure contiguousness between the two areas where Palestinians live in great numbers, West Bank and Gaza? By the way, with two totally different political realities, that's another thing. An Islamo-fascist, broken organization that spent all of its money on tunnels and war-making, and a moderate but corrupt and weak Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So how do you square that? Settlements, Jerusalem, and the law of return, or the right of return. And again, it's vexing for Palestinians who say, well, the Jews have a right to return, why not us? Well, we can give lots of good reasons, but I'll give you the number one. It would destroy Israel's function as the Jewish state. That's Israel's big worry. It's mostly demographic. It's that if Palestinians can return to the homes that their grandparents lived in 1946 or 1933, what? Which do exist in some places, but largely don't exist, anymore. That's why the neighborhoods where they do exist in Jerusalem become such flashpoints like Sheikh Jarrah, May of 2021. We'll get there in 2 weeks' time. what was happening in May of 2021. We've all forgotten it, but it was a very big deal at the time. It was a very ugly confrontation between Israelis and Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and even in the streets of Israeli cities that had Jewish population and Arab population. You had Arabs taking knives and murdering Jews, and vice versa. Very bad. But the issue is that it would destroy the demography in such a way that it could no longer be the Jewish state. It could be what Mamdani calls for, which is I don't think it would be, but he calls for a single binational democratic state with equal rights for all. The problem with that is what I told you 3 times today, that most people in that region are very leery of democracy to begin with, and that a Palestinian majority state gives us no confidence that it would be a democracy and who would administer it. And so, the Jews ain't gonna buy it. Like that, more to the point, my point is just as a kind of like a cynical realist, that's not going to happen. Israel will never allow that to happen. But the Palestinian right of return remains one of the unresolved sticking points that has never been sorted out in any negotiation. Patty. Yeah, I'm going to teach you a very important phrase in Israeli politics. It's called the status quo. There was no strategic plan. By the way, this is very typical. Like, I think the biggest knock on the last 2 years has been that it was all about tactics and not about strategy. There was never until, even today, it's hard for me to know because I'm not in the room, to quote Hamilton, where it happens. I would hope today that there are some back channel conversations that have been happening for a while about now that the hostages are home and Hamas is badly debilitated, even with its attempts to regroup, and Hezbollah and Iran are badly, badly, badly debilitated, that Israel has an historic opportunity here to think about strategy and not just tactics. But there was never a, we're going to shut down the peace process because we have a better vision of how to build a future. That's never been the thinking. Michelle. Until who takes over? Ah. No. Right. No, yeah, exactly. I don't remember when this was imposed, but the administration of the Temple Mount is by an Islamic organization called the Waqf. It's WAQF. I don't know what it means. But they oversee visitation rights to the Temple Mount. Jewish people are not really supposed to be up there, but they do permit very, very, very limited hours a few times a week when Jews can go up there. But you can't, worship. It is considered an affront to the pious Muslims. Well, by the way, the third holiest site in all of Islam is there today. It's our Temple Mount, but we've enshrined the Western Wall, which is the retaining wall, beneath the mountain, at the foot of the mountain. So you're talking up there. I've been there once. I'll tell you more about my experience up there. They will let groups go there, but they will not let explicitly Jewish groups go there often. But even then, they make some permissions, and there are still Knesset members whose main program is, we got to get more Jews praying on the Temple Mount. And every time that happens, I'm like, see, religion ruins everything. Yes. Yeah. I went last November. I went November of 24 with Daniel Reeser and the reason we were able to get permission to go up there, we had our own security detail. We went with an interfaith clergy group. So 8 of us were Christian ministers from around Westchester, and 6 of us were rabbis. And it was cool. And I'm not going to hang out there. It does nothing for me spiritually. Let me just say what we're going to look forward to next week. So we're in the middle of the Second Intifada. Israel decides that the only way it can protect its citizens is through separation. And so they implement the building of a protective barrier across the entire Green Line, effectively. And they wall off Gaza as well, even more. The idea, so it's sometimes called an apartheid wall. That was not the point. It's a security barrier. At times it is a wall, a very high wall. You can see it snaking around Jerusalem. More than 90% of it is not a wall. It is a fence. You can see across it. But, it's a fence. And Robert Frost was always ambivalent about the following claim. But he did say good fences make good neighbors. I've studied the poem Mending Wall 1,000 times. Every time I come away with an understanding that he means it and he doesn't mean it. Good fences do and do not make good neighbors. And I've talked about this a lot. That's why it's poetry. And I'm a poetry guy. I'm not really a political scientist. I should have studied poli-sci. I've come to take a liking to it. Sharon decides that this is the only way that we can prevent suicide bombings. I mean, that's really what it was. It was about radicalized youth, mostly from the West Bank, infiltrating major metropolitan areas in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and blowing themselves up and taking dozens or more down with them. We'll talk about some of the particular horrors where they were attacked. There were some that were particularly grievous for Israelis, not just in terms of the body count, but youth being massacred by bombs at a nightclub at a very busy time, the Dolphinarium in Tel Aviv, a Seder in Netanya. Like, some of these were also calculated for massive, not just physical trauma, but psychological trauma. And you really have a traumatized Israeli population. I'm willing to go, and say I think the Palestinian population it has been traumatized for most of its existence and feeds itself on its own trauma. I think a lot of Jews feed themselves on their own trauma. But at this time, it was just what a friend of mine calls a traumatorium. Living in Israel at the time, I have friends who did come home from their year in Israel of rabbinical studies at HUC. I have others who stuck it out. I have classmates or friends, colleagues who bought bulletproof vests, who bought gas masks. Living in Israel at that time, I think, was very difficult, particularly for an American Jew. And the kind of where this will lead, then again, I'll recap this at the beginning of next week, but I just want you to see what's on the horizon because I wanted to get at least a 10-year unit in, but I spent a lot of time setting up the first Intifada, without which you can't understand the second. Sharon also, Sharon's 2 big military strategic decisions during his time as prime minister were the building of the security barrier and the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. And that's in 2005. And we're really going to talk about that because at the time there were 9,000 some odd Jewish hardline religious settlers living in Gaza. And Sharon actually, starting in 2003, in private conversations with his inner circle, he actually used the word for the first time of any Israeli official. He said, "This situation is occupation. It cannot last long. It is both a moral and a strategic catastrophe for the Jewish state." And recognizing that he did not see a pathway to a negotiated withdrawal from Gaza, so he said, let's try something new. Let's just dismantle the settlements with our own IDF forces and get out of Gaza. And we're going to see what happened after that. Right? I mean, even if the intentions were noble, we're going to see what happened after that. And I'll give you one last spoiler. 2 months after the Gaza withdrawal, Sharon would experience a massive stroke that put him in a vegetative state for 8 years. And in Israel, because of the entanglements between ultra-Orthodox Judaism and law, you can't just pull the plug. I've had this issue at WRT. I've had families visiting in Israel, and all of a sudden, like a family trip where grandpa had a massive heart attack, had to be on life support, and the family learned to their horror that even though he had a DNR here in the States, no Israeli hospital would honor it. So I had this situation about 2 years ago where congregants were calling us in an understandable great deal of psychic distress because they had gone to Israel for a 7-day trip, but they couldn't take grandpa home. And grandpa was basically on a ventilator. And it was, I'll tell you how that wound up later, but it was quite a story. So Sharon would persist in a vegetative state for 8 years, finally dying in 2013, I think. So we'll get to 2005 next week, and we're going to make our way to 2015, give or take. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Lenny. Yep. Come see me.